Well, of course, I have to thank my very dear friend, and we go back a ways now.
Yeah, 22 years.
Okay,
But
put a
it's
number on
valid.
it. Dr. Bonds for hosting me, and Villanova in general, and Unit for doing the recording, and thanks to all of you for being here. So the way we'll do this is I'm going to talk a bit, and I'm going to shoot a few poems in between the talk. So, but mostly Dr. Bonds told me that I should focus on my research. And see, you all are, I don't know if you all brought a sandwich, because, you know, I can go a while on this subject. But I thought I would start out with, I have a sort of, I call it the preamble, what I usually say before I start at a more typical poetry reading, because it gives you, you know, just a kind of way to see what I was thinking about. So again, the subject of my book, just to make sure we're fully on the same page to get started, is Anna Mary Douglas, who was born in 1813 and died in 1882. For 44 years of her adult life, she was married to Frederick Douglass. Something else I was going to say about her. I don't. It'll come out. And so the work is called Brief Evidence of Heaven, and I'll probably read the poem that the title came from at some point. So all of the poems in the book are persona poems. And if you're not aware of what a persona poem is, anytime there's any voice you hear in the poem is not my voice as the poet, my voice as the subject. It's not my story. Even when it's first person, I'm never speaking as myself. So all of the poems are taking on and imagining somebody else's voice. Mostly Anna Mary Douglas, but also there are some other people who wanted in on the project. So you may hear from one or two of them too. And then we'll have questions in case Dr. Bonds didn't say that. So here we go. Curious, visionary, pragmatic, sensitive, perceptive, kind, analytical, dreamy, mystical, insecure, deliberate, vigilant. These qualities and more I perceived in Anna Mary Douglas through 2.5 years of research that led me to these poems. The gems of that research were these: a booklet titled My Mother as I Recall Her by Rosetta Douglas Sprague, the painting of Anna Mary Douglas by O.W. Brooks that hangs in Cedar Hill on W Street in Washington, D.C., the notes I took there, as well as in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Rochester, New York, and especially at the Baltimore Harbor. I spent a long while studying her picture and those fragments of information and impressions. Once I realized that I had invented a voice for Anna Mary Douglas, I realized that I could imagine her life also. Amid piles of history books, websites, 19th century letters full of silences and scant inferences, and Rosetta's carefully veiled observations, I reminded myself that I am a poet and that facts are not the same as truth. However, the facts seem to be these. Anna Mary Douglas was born free in Denton, Maryland. She was never enslaved. She never gained a mastery of reading and writing. After meeting Frederick Bailey in Baltimore at the harbor, the two married, and she remained his wife for 44 years, raising 5 children, one of whom died at age 10. Anna Mary Douglas gave Frederick Douglass, who he later became, money and aid to flee enslavement. Without her ingenuity, labor, and vision, we might not know the icon Frederick Douglass today. So some of the themes, and again, just overview. Then I have some fun slides to show you. So, and I'll kind of talk in between. I noticed when the book was published, and I started going around doing readings, that there were these big themes, and I guess I knew that somewhere in my poet brain while I was working, but you can't think about everything at once, so you never get anything done. So some of the themes that come up in the book are her mystic capacity, which that was a decision of mine. I determined that she was a mystic, that she may have been psychic, that she had supernatural ways of knowing things as well as the ways that we tend to see as normal, that she had a hunger to learn. And so there's a whole quest for knowledge and literacy that comes through. And you'll see more about this in the slides. That she was an activist in her own right, that she had her own activist vision for what should happen for Black people in this country. She had a passion for beauty and progress, particularly for Black people. She had a definitive sense of self, and she had a fascination with and an ability to grasp numbers. So there's a lot of little number things in the book. Some of them are just me having fun by myself that nobody else would really know are there. But so those are some of the themes, and then to those I'll add relationships. There's several poems that kind of raise a question or cast an eye on some of her relationships. And particularly, I'm thinking of with her youngest daughter, Annie, the one who died, sort of inversely with her oldest daughter, Rosetta, and they, if you know anything about mothers and daughters, especially when that daughter is the first child, there was tension in their relationship. Relationships with other people in the abolitionist community also come up. So, with that, I will stop the overview, get my book lined up here, and we'll just get started. Let's see, from the beginning. Here we go. So, let's move on. So one of the things Dr. Bonds talked about with me to get started, to get me started rather, to jumpstart my approach to this talk, was that some students and possibly other people didn't understand or didn't realize that poems involve research. They don't always, obviously. I mean, if you grasp how many people are writing poetry in the world at this point, there's any and everything can be said. But poems definitely can involve research, and I see and understand my work on this book as part of actually a quite definitive trend among contemporary African American poets. So this one that I'm quoting in this slide is one of the ones who's closest to my heart, the late Lucille Clifton. And there she has it, summed up in a sort of flippant Lucille way. I mean, in order to write about something, you have to find out about it, and exactly that. That's the poet's challenge. So everything, it might be part of your poetry baggage to think that poets just get, sort of filled with some vision and sit down and spill it all out in some dramatic Hollywood fashion, and that's the end of that. And, if that was the case, my lawn would look a lot different than it does, and, my study would be a lot neater. There would be so much more time. But, in fact, what poets get filled with is a curiosity, a passion to know more, a passion to sort of get immersed in a set of ideas, a point of view, a consciousness, a way of seeing the world, a way of handling language that helps us do that. And we're just people that got to put the trash out and recycle and everything else. So we have to go find out. So just to sort of clarify a bit the tradition piece that I mentioned, I'm just going to mention a few books by contemporary African American poets that are heavily researched. So one of the earliest books I read that sort of actually set me on this path was called Women of the Plums by the late Dolores Kendrick, about enslaved women. All the poems were looking at their lives. My good friend Tyemba Jess, who actually was here last year,
Yes, he
was that last winter, I think, has done two. Tyemba is a very strong pulse underneath my work. He read early drafts of poems and talked to me about research, talked me out of having footnotes, all sorts of things. But Tyemba's sort of star turn as a beginning poet was called Leadbelly, a book of persona poems about Leadbelly, the blues musician. And then his more recent book, Olio, is also looking at the American minstrel tradition. Some of those poems are in persona, some are not. But in Leadbelly, all of the poems are persona poems. And they're not just Leadbelly. His guitar actually has poems in its voice. So he did some creative things. Another very good friend of mine, Jacqueline Jones Lamont, wrote a book called Last Scene that gave voice to some of the people that surrounded the missing, the fairly large number of missing black children in the United States. So she gave voice to police detectives, parents, the father who nodded out on the park bench and the child goes missing from the stroller, that kind of approach. Marilyn Nelson did a book called Carver, A Life in Poems, which was also a big push to me about the life of George Washington Carver, the botanist, African-American botanist. So, and then one of my favorite people, Van Jordan, a few years ago did a book called Magnolia, which looked at the experiences of a real woman. I'm forgetting her last name, but her first name was actually Magnolia. She grew up in the 1930s in Akron, Ohio, and she would have been the spelling bee champion, national champion. But when she went to the competition in Washington, D.C., the folks on the panel weren't ready to have a young black girl in the 1930s be the spelling bee champion. They couldn't handle that level of black excellence. And so they undermined her answer so that it wouldn't count for the prize. So Van does a whole array of poems about Magnolia's life and what eventually happens to her when she comes back and grows up and goes on with her life. So there is a very distinct thread, and there's others. That was just a sampling among my peers, and I'm happy to say some of them are my friends as well, who see the silences in African American stories and feel that they can bring poems to the work of unearthing those silences. And so that's kind of the spirit in which I do this work. But I'm always and ever grateful to Lucille Clifton, just for being alive, just for being a married woman with 6 children, 6, not the neat little 2 like I have. 6 children, 3 in diapers at one time. And Lucille, made a considerable poetry career. So anything Lucille says, I stop to listen to it and draw it in. So research, it's a thing poets do. Here are some of the, and I will say, while I have my issues with technology and digitization of the world, I do love the internet. So these, as far as I know, These are the only two images of Anna Mary Douglas that exist. I should have had them in sort of reverse order, I guess, but one is a painting and one is a photograph. You can see that early, grainy photographic quality from the 19th century. But she was clearly much younger in this picture, in the painting, than in the photograph. 1873, so that's, I can do this math. That's 9 years before she died. So she was already, her health was failing at that point. But these are not just, oh, that's nice, Dr. Keita, you found some photographs. For a long time, or for some considerable amount of time, because honestly, the time factor has blurred a little bit. But these photographs were, and others were definitely part of my active research. For a long time, they were up on the wall in my study at home, and I used to stare at them and, and take notes about them and try to figure out what I saw in her eyes and what was behind her eyes and, what was her posture all about, and just try to feel what I could feel from her in these two images. So they were definitely more than just incidentals. This is probably the famous passage that it reads a little differently in the life and times of Frederick Douglass than in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And probably more of you, if you've read anything of his, you've probably read the narrative because it's a shorter book. It's a skinny little book. This was significant to me because this is where I started Brief Evidence. I was teaching at Westchester, and we used to teach a whole course on how to do research, how to write a research paper. I did not want to read 20 research papers about why the drinking age should be 18 in Pennsylvania. I was not interested in euthanasia as a subject matter. So, etc., or some other paper that might be purchased, for the right price. So I decided that that research class was going to go on a journey, and we were going to actually learn something. I was going to try to get them curious about some aspect of Frederick Douglass's life or life at that period in the United States. And then they would go off and research something that spiraled out of our reading of the narrative. So it's a very skinny little book. So I was like, oh, they won't mind reading this. This will go pretty quickly, and we'll have some interesting conversations. And then I'll send them to the library. Well, guess who went to the library first? I read this, a similar passage to this. He basically is talking about the same moment. And I went, wait a minute. Frederick Douglass had a wife. And from there to this moment, that's the scope that's contained in that question. So I had read it probably when I was an undergrad, but I didn't remember that detail. I didn't think anything about it. It's history, dead people, whatever. But when I read it this time, by this time I'm a grown woman, I'm a wife, I'm somebody's mother, and it hit me entirely differently. And I started asking myself questions. I've never heard of her. What was she doing all this time? Kids? 5 kids? I just was stunned at the implications. And also the fact that he never, in this passage, he doesn't name her. So anyway, this is the piece of research that got me started on my long quest to answer those questions. And he just talks about, this is the moment after he's escaped. He's in New York. If you know where Church Street is, it's way down at the lower Manhattan. And he was skulking around, looking for contacts, people that he could help him get to his next stop. And his wife, Anna Mary, comes up from Maryland, and they get married, and so the myth begins. So this was a bit from, the wonderful Dr. William McFeely, who wrote Frederick Douglass, the biography in 1991. Another great find in my never-ending search for material. Because, and I'm getting a little bit off my track, when I got my question in my head, who is this wife of his? Well, there's a lucky coincidence there. I happen to be married to a historian, Dr. Keita, who teaches here. And I knew that he had, anything I wanted to find on Frederick Douglass, or at least a lot, I could just go across the hall to his study. And, so I did that. I'm like, give me all your Douglass. I gotta look up some things. So I thought I was like knee deep in the project already. I start looking at anybody who's got grad school tendencies. You don't read from the table of contents, you go to the index. So I go to the index and I'm not finding anything too much. Or I'm finding that same passage I just showed you, variations of that. In the other history books he gave me, similar, riffs on that. So I'm sort of, my trail is, as they say, going cold already. So when I read, I grabbed onto William McFeely's book, and when I went to the index, there were maybe 7 or 8 or 9 different pages to look up. I'm like, oh, hallelujah. So this is one of the things that got me to think about Anna as her own person, Anna as an activist, Anna as, most importantly, and I still was on the fence about doing, I thought I was going to do a few poems, people, a few poems. And, and I just wanted something to go on. But when I found out that she was married to him for so long, and I already knew that nobody probably knows who she is, because I'm kind of a history geek on the side, and I had never heard of her. But when I found out that she helped him escape, and yet, when I scrolled through the life and times of Frederick Douglass, there's published well after slavery's over, by the way, in 1892. There's no mention of her still, or very little. What I showed you 2 screens ago. Very little mention of her. And I'm like, what's going on? You wouldn't even be where you are without this woman. So, okay, so, my feminist dander's getting up and, anyway. So, so that's kind of one of the passages that was really important to me, because William McFeely looked beyond the facts that nobody wrote down. And he did kind of his historian version of what I started to do, was to just think about what's in the gaps. What's going on for the people that the camera's not focusing on. So, yeah, and you can see a sort of openness to her where he says she worked as a domestic servant as hard as he. We're not talking about some stereotypical white middle-class American woman who didn't have a job until World War II. That whole mythology. We're talking about a black woman whose parents were enslaved. So work is a given for her. But he recognizes that as hard as he. Another one of my pinches on this project was that, and I'm so regretful that I've not ever found this book again to cite it properly. There was a historian, and one day I am going to find it, who said, Anna Mary Douglass, and obviously paraphrasing, she was not Frederick Douglass's intellectual equal. So that I just went, oh, that was the boat's over the waterfall now. I'm doing it. I don't care how many poems I'm writing. I'm in this project. Because I'm like, how does he know that? How does he know that? So I very much appreciated McFeely and wrote him a little note, and he wrote back. I love to do that. So here was a question I then faced. Well, I know a few things about black women in the 20th century, having been raised by them, among other things. But I was trying to, and I did a lot of reading, skimming, half reading, chapter reading, trying to, sort of just locate her. Because the fact that she wasn't enslaved, it's not that I didn't know there weren't women in that category, but she was also poor. And that's an interesting intersection. So, which implies that you've got to work for a living. So she wasn't one of these pastors' wives in Massachusetts or something, or Philadelphia. But Philadelphia had an early middle class sliver of a black community, actually a substantial one, for the times, and various other places in the North did as well. But she didn't come from that. As I said, her parents had been enslaved. So I was trying to figure out, where did she fit? That second picture, if you don't know, is the marvelous Sojourner Truth, who also never learned to read and write, but who pushed right past that and went and traveled around the country speaking as an abolitionist. You all have probably had to read Ain't I a Woman at some point, and if you haven't, just go do it. But and the firebrand on the end is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who this woman used to carry a gun in the 1890s. She was a journalist. She was born into slavery, but later, when the emancipation did its work, she was formerly enslaved, and she had a different set of resources and skills. And she managed to get literate, she managed to go to school, she became a journalist, she became an anti-lynching crusader, and I'm not talking about from an easy distance. I'm talking about when black folks got lynched like people, buy a newspaper all the time. So, and not just in the South, please, let's remember that. So I mean, I couldn't figure her out. Was she one of these women who had been enslaved, like the woman in the third picture, who, what else is there for them to do in the economy, but the same types of jobs or similar jobs to what they did when slavery was up and running? So she certainly wasn't the lady at the far end who had skin color privilege as well as a sort of class privilege. So I'm trying to figure her out. And then the internet comes to the rescue. And I find, I'd been like meaning to go on the Smithsonian website and see what they had to offer. They have a whole section on Frederick Douglass, like just massive links under that section. One of the links is this book, which was written by Rosetta Douglass Sprague, their oldest child. She wrote it in 1900, so well after, 18 years after Anna Murray is dead. But this little book is about 26, 28 pages. But it didn't matter. I was like, finally, I've got somebody's looking at her, talking about her, and who better than her daughter? So I was over the moon just when I got to the cover. She, if you've read anything or studied the 19th century, their discourse was not like ours. They didn't say everything they thought. They didn't use slang all the time. And things weren't always direct, especially when women were doing the writing. So even when I read the book, I don't know, I read the book countless times. There were little funny silences. You know how you say things by not saying them? So there was some of that. But still, the book was a godsend to me. So what was Anna's personality? These are four highlights from her daughter's point of view. So imagine, this was like, all I had to go on mostly was a little from William McFeely, sensitive historian that he was, the photograph and the painting, and all the things that the Douglass historians weren't saying. So now finally I get, she was a woman, strong in her likes and dislikes. So I take that thread and I put it together with the painting, and I'm staring some more. But now I'm seeing things in a different way. So, and then while this didn't come up until later in my mind, somewhere back in my head, a voice was saying, so she's like your grandmother. Another woman, strong in her likes and dislikes. She was a Christian, but she wasn't a sitting in church observing who doesn't have their gloves on Christian. She was a getting up, walking around, witnessing and acting on her Christian beliefs. So I had a feeling that, getting to church on Sunday wasn't always her first priority. She abhorred shams. I just love that that line as a poet, just because it's so crisp and tight, and it says so much with 3 words. She abhorred shams. In other words, another way of saying that in a more contemporary way is she took no prisoners. So come correct when you're talking to Mrs. Douglas, or leave her alone. So as I discovered that she actually never learned to read and write, I also discovered from other things I was reading, because again, on the internet, I'm like reading stuff about people who are good with numbers, like Googling this and that. And I found these interesting snippets that gave me a sense that of what she might have been like, what her interior and her approach to people might have been. Because, again, she's moving around among, once Frederick Douglass gets really famous, he's basically like the president, the black president in the 19th century. So all kinds of people are interfacing with her, people like some of those women I showed you in the previous slide, who've, they've got their 3 forks on the left and all that. She's not that kind of woman. She doesn't have that kind of social protocol as a priority. So I'm thinking, how was she interacting in those kind of spaces? And just, the fact that she wasn't good with talking, she wasn't reading a literary person, but she was a calculator. So I thought that second clip that talks about someone who's in this category who's very numerate, but not social, it was a real effort for me to look someone in the eye. That matched up with what her daughter said about her. So I started getting somewhere by now. And then I got this question. I don't know, you know how you go in those rabbit holes on the internet, you don't know how you got there. You're like 6 clicks down from where you started. You're like, suddenly I'm reading an article about savants, which came from thinking about the number thing. And you have McFeely, who says she's done what many of us cannot do, mastered the checkbook. Okay, but larger words were beyond her. And then I'm reading the Savant article that says, lightning calculating can be a mark of people who have that kind of ability. So also on the website, the Smithsonian website, I found these photographs, which was a great help in my photo staring project. I spent a long time looking at, they were up on the wall too. These are the 4 children that came to adulthood. Never found a picture of Annie yet, but I believe there's one out there. And I looked at them for several things. For one thing, they're more than 100 years before the natural hair movement. But one of the things we all think about with Frederick Douglass is that hair, And I'm like, what were they doing with their hair? Because they clearly weren't cutting it all off. So I was like, interesting. One of them's got a rough afro thing happening. Frederick Jr. is trying to do a side comb. But so I was looking at their hair, but of course I was looking at just how much they look like her, where Frederick Douglass is in their features and where's her in their features. And then just the soul and the spirit of these young people that are coming out of their eyes and out of their postures. And thinking about, again, what did it mean to be Frederick Douglass's kids? My goodness. A funny little Villanova side note, my oldest son graduated from Nova in '07. as I said, his father works here and has been here for a long time. He did not want anybody to know he was Nzadi Keita's kid. And he would skulk around. I used to say, you know, that lots of good stuff in the history department. You should check. Mom, I'm not taking a history department class. Because he didn't, you know, he wanted to have his own space where he wasn't, oh, Nzadi's kid is in there, you know, that type of thing. So, and I kept trying to encourage him. I'm like, Villanova is a big place. Come on, it's not like where I teach, where I could, you know, there's like 1,700 students, for goodness sake. It's tiny. But he did not want, he just wanted to be a free agent. He didn't want the name to precede him everywhere. So, you know, that consciousness made me look at these and go, oh my goodness, what, you know, everywhere they went, they were Frederick Douglass's kids. And what kinds of expectations were on them? Because that was all fine and good, but like their father had done this great and phenomenal thing with their mother's help of escaping from slavery. But these four, they weren't raised in the hard situations that their parents endured. You know, they had that generational leap whereby they had clothes to wear, nobody was whipping them, nobody was denying them food, they knew who their parents were, and they lived with them. That in itself was radical for black folk at that point in time, coming through 300 years of American slavery. Just the fact that they lived as a family unit. They ate dinner at the table together. Those things weren't possible for young people some years ahead of them. So I was just so fascinated by what were their lives like. So anyway, you know, and then and again, like as black folks would say, African American folks, Anna Mary spit them out. Like is Douglass in there anywhere? Like Frederick Jr. a little bit, you know, but so, you know, what kind of sway did she have over them as the mother, you know? So I was very, very interested to find those photographs. I told you that literacy was an issue. Oh, I do have to read some poems too, but all right. I think I'll just get through this and then I'll do the reading. How about that? So Anna was, she was a striver. I don't believe she intended or wanted or was satisfied with being a person who couldn't read. And so efforts continued to correct for that. One of the poems some of you had a chance to read was called Letter D. And in that poem, there's a series of alphabet poems in the book where I imagine her looking at the alphabet, trying to sort it out on her own with her analytical math mind, and trying to sort of come up with a relationship to each of the letters of the alphabet in a way to get her to the next phase. But, you know, Rosetta, who is, you know, that dynamic between her and Rosetta, with Rosetta having to read for her, is not unlike the situation of many immigrant mamas where their whole effort was on getting people to the next place. They didn't have time to go learn English fluently and read. So they come up in a situation where they're in a new place, their children are going to school, but they haven't gone to school. So they have to sometimes have things read to them. They have to take somebody with them to go to the store and translate. And so, you know, that's the situation in which she found herself. This was a house that they lived in Rochester, New York, something I found on the internet. It's no longer there. But again, you know, just with finding that out, I intersected that with other research that told me that after they moved to a bigger house, the house where the Underground Railroad work went on, which was a big house on a farmland. But this was their first house, but she kept that house so that they could what? Make extra money, because she was smart. Anna's ideals and values, I found material about that in various places, various articles. Always, always the things I found would usually be about Frederick Douglass. But I was combing through, looking for the one or two sentences that said something about her and how she was involved. So I love that line from Victoria Schmidt, who says, who quotes somebody who says, she had very aristocratic ideas. And I matched that up with her posture in that painting, And yeah, she was a striver. And an activist. She saved money to donate to the anti-slavery cause. I'm sitting there going, yeah, so why haven't you sent that check to Black Lives Matter yet? Come on. That's, just in total defense, I should have been in the hospital that day. So if I look bad, and I do, I had, what's the thing? Laryngitis. I had extreme laryngitis. I was really super sick. I should not have taken that trip. But you know how you start coughing, you think you can suppress it, and it morphs into a monster. But so that was a rough trip, and I didn't get to do most of what I wanted to do there. But we did drive to Rochester that summer, my husband and I did find her grave. And as it says there, I can better read it here. So her name is on the side of a pillar. If you walk into that cemetery and you don't know any better, you're going to see Frederick Douglass's stone is about as big as those two tables together. And it's thick, it's very high. And his second wife, 30 years younger and white, his second wife, her gravestone is maybe half of that volume, but it's very prominent and it's right next to his. So you go, oh, so here's his wife. Okay, end of story, let's move on. No, there's a pillar in back of those two which marks where Anna Mary Douglass is buried. And her name is, when you look straight on, you don't even see her name. It's only because I went on the internet and looked up the gravesite in advance that I knew where to look for the carving of her name, which is on the side. And she and Annie, the girl child, are buried under that stone. But yeah. So, my sense is that was more a thing. Her kids struggled as they came to adulthood to make a living. And, it was probably very expensive to get a headstone like that. So they didn't get but so much put on it. But I think it's sad that, she's a wife, that's it. We don't get any further sense of her or even her full name. And certainly not, the fact that she was born before she died. So there was that bit of physical research that went on that was really quite exciting, even though that was a rough one. I wasn't well. There is the last place she lived in Washington, D.C. It is now part of the National Park Service. And you can go there and you can take the tours I did. And if you do, I will say to you what somebody could have said to me, don't hassle the man who gives the tour. He's just doing his job. But part of his job is to create this web of mythology about Frederick Douglass that makes it sound like he did everything. And he did not. Okay, I'm really zipping now. I'm going to read some poems and then we'll talk. In 2014, after the book was published, I can't even remember how this happened. I'll figure it out maybe if somebody wants to know. But I got in touch with, or was put in touch with the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation, which is run by the lady in the middle, Nettie Washington Douglass. So you can see the relationship, great-great-granddaughter. So that pushes us forward to, like, they didn't just all die out. In fact, her name is Washington because somebody's grandmother married somebody in Booker T. Washington's family. Isn't that incredible? So the Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass eventually their bloodlines connect. So this lady is a product of that connection. So and there's my cute little mama. I come to Atlanta both to see her and to meet with them, and that was kind of a high moment to be able to bring a book and give it to a Douglas relative. It was very special. And my last photo is Cedar Hill. That's an image that you see. If you take the tour and you go into the parlor, you'll see that lamp sitting there. So yes, Anna did live there and died there, and Anna's with us still. Now I am going to leave that up and I'm going to read some poems. And we might go a little over on the Q&A, Dr. Barnes, but not too much. So, the way I did this book, because a lot of people don't know anything about her, I thought I had all these fancy poetic ideas in mind, and then something just said, hey, just go in order. There's something to be said for chronological order. So the first chunk of poems comes from the time when she lived in Baltimore, when she met her future husband. The next chunk comes from their time in Massachusetts, where they lived after he escaped. Then comes Rochester, which is my longest section, which is where they became most famous with the Underground Railroad. And finally, Washington, D.C., the house on W Street where she died in 1882. So Dr. Bonds gave out some poems, and I'm going to read those and maybe two more, and then we can talk. So scribble down if you have a question. If you're anything like me, you might forget it, so scribble it down. This first poem is called 1837, Cold Magic. So only thing you need to know, I told you that they met on the dock. She was a domestic worker, a laundress to be exact. He was still enslaved, but one interesting thing that plantation owners used to do, if they had a troublesome Negro who wouldn't follow directions and didn't go with the flow at the plantation, they would still make money on them, but they would send them somewhere else to work. And they sent Frederick Douglass, who was such a person, to the docks to work as a laborer on the docks. So he was still enslaved when he met her there. And this poem is just about, you'll see. 1837, Cold Magic. Back corner of the top drawer, black as a Bible. My box of coins hides, calling to each dream I claim. Every small pile tied to a day. My coins count by different tomorrows, calling to each the same way a net sings to fish, sings them close to circle what calls their names. Every stack of coins climbs by threes. Every set of stairs marks time, 2 + 1. I'll forget hunger if I keep in step. I'll scrub the butcher's aprons back to cream. Seeds in the dark drawer, singing in bright piles. Hours and shirt collars serve those flat, golden eyes. Each coin wrapped in a picture of its own. Passage on a train to Halifax. A black wool coat. Part of my place research was that, I don't know why, I think because a lot of African Americans did not, they didn't stop. It was nice to have some soup at the Douglases or whatever, but they pushed on and went to Canada and got out of this game show. And so Halifax got interesting to me. I guess it was because it was so much at a distance, and I found out that there is a old black community in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So that's, Halifax kept popping up after I found that out. I'm going to read Caleb Pullen, Cabin Boy. Now, I said a long time ago, you've probably had a nap and woke up since then, but that I decided that I felt that she was had psychic knowledge, and that comes up here. Caleb Pullen, I totally invented him, completely. Don't be the first to greet her. She dip a hand in salt water when you come in her way. Wait. And wait some more, you better. And don't be first to speak. Let her take you up in mind. Let her do that. Miss Anna Mary ain't forgot she's African. Everybody, least the Negroes on the dock, used all her names. Any black woman can twist her hair like an Indian, know what's inside a sack before she see it, and cook food that switches arms to legs and back. You can't be playing lightly with. You can't be gambling. The Calla Lily had another captain who tried Miss Anna Virtue, or thought he could, before the one there now. Cook and them say she choke him with a starch string tie, inches from the end, they say. But her hands was folded most of the time. Cap tell the first mate, go on, pay her if you have to. Say, get me off this chain. Say he apologize. And sailors don't sniff at tails. So thanks to Dr. Bond. I rarely read that one, but wanted to hear that one. Another one I rarely read is letter D. I don't even know what page it's on. Oh, 34. I'll read, actually that's in the New England section, so before I get to that, I'll read Making New England's Acquaintance. Because again, remember she was from Maryland. And Maryland's, you know, it's a little bit south. It's warmer. Is there anybody here who's from Massachusetts or New England? A little nippy in the winter, huh? Just a little bit, right? Yeah, even with global warming. It's 1838, Making New England's Acquaintance. Winter is a man, that much is certain. Not so old, but hungry for attention, and whatever keeps knees working as they should. I do wrestle with his brother, Massachusetts. Sometimes toss a fist of laughter back at him, my kind of fire. List my people's names to burn his breath. Cough the strength saved up in me with work and water. Strength I counted on to cross the creek and bay. Cold up here is something to be broken. Shackles that no dollar price can pay. The ice on morning buckets. Every day's white wall. And letter D. So my concept with these alphabet poems was I see her copying the alphabet somewhere to herself, trying it out, thinking about it one letter at a time, and paying attention to the letters that matter something to her. Because she's not a linear thinker necessarily, and she can't take it all in that way. So the letter D, you know, is Douglas, which is her new last name. Bowl being contrary, rolled over. Plate holding on to its job as lid. Drum sleeping till the right time. Loaf in a too hungry hand. Cave of a waiting woman's belly. Plum stopped on its way to fullness. Room built for secrets. door to a rounder world. Okay, it's 2:32. I'm going to read two poems from the back of the book. You all have been a very commendable audience. I am getting tired of the sound of my voice, so I know you all are, stretching it. No. I just have to say, though, while I'm looking for this poem, I never expected this book to get this long because I had so little to work with. I figured if I get like a chapbook, which is, like a little skinny poetry book, I'll be doing fine. But the fact is, once Anna Mary, as I would say, figured out that I was going to respect her and that I was going to tell some things that might need to be said, even if I got them a little bit wrong, I think she sort of, in a spiritual way, gave herself to me. So I'm going to read, where is it? Here it is. The title poem, which comes from the last section. So by this time, she's in Washington, D.C., living in that big house on the hill. This house still, even though with the rampant gentrification that's taken over Washington, D.C., this house is still up on a hill so high that you can see half of the city from the front porch. So that's where she was. She was older. Their house in Rochester had been set on fire by somebody that, was opposed to the Underground Railroad, and they moved to D.C. And so I see her laying on a couch or a divan, or maybe even on the front porch, thinking this. It's called I Own. She used to drag me forward, still asleep, flash sideways, part the grass. She tumbled bushel baskets in the market air. Now here she is, my body, my kettle, my wild lantern proud as brass. I never hated her. In fact, she split whole days and curled their edges. She took a knife to closed roads. And here she is, still necessary, bettermost among my books, a scythe that dulls and weakens against stone, my brief evidence of heaven, blessed slate with its own curves and strokes, a hurricane before I knew the word. Sleepless now, I guard her, little left but gaze and time. I have never hated her. And I will close with one of the oldest poems, meaning it was one of the first ones I did that I said, okay, this one won't go in the trash or, in the dump file. I'm actually going to use this one. So that's another myth about poets that, it's sort of that, well, it's done, you're going to, it's going to go to the next phase. A lot of poems don't, oh, I forgot about this. Oh, well. A lot of poems don't, they don't work. But this one seemed to work. It starts with an epigraph, a little quote, research again, from Rosetta's little booklet that I mentioned several times. And that I acted out, a little bit about when I was on the Douglas House tour. That man was so glad when I was going. I kept asking questions. He's looking at me like, oh God, I've got one of those, What about Mrs. Douglas? Where was Mrs. Douglas in all this? And he's like, lady, I'm on a script. Could you leave me alone? So anyway, but it speaks to, the issue that they have yet to understand that organization. And the quote is, "It was no unusual occurrence for mother to be called up at all hours of the night, cold or hot as the case may be, to prepare supper for a hungry lot of fleeing humanity." Now, if you haven't digested every detail of Frederick Douglass's life, shame on you, teasing. There's a famous story when he's about 17 or 18. He's a big guy, you know, he's been working, he's muscled, he's strong. But as I said before, he's one of those they would call a troublemaker. And they being the owners of the property, the so-called owners of the people, but I don't subscribe to that. They put him under the care of a man named Mr. Covey, who was known to break rebellious people. It didn't work. Frederick Douglass beat us behind, basically. But Covey gets mentioned in here, so that's who he is. Okay, here we go. History. We will be something more than we are now. Our crumbled days and nights, our saddest parts will mix like ash and dirt, kept secret, pounded down by traveling feet. Some later man will cry some rugged song in praise to Douglass, write the sun up as he used to do. Then walk a while with God, but never knowing. Walk in the leaves, trampling afternoon. His thoughts will tumble, words all dressed in flags and velvet, swelling up like boils, jumping to his feet, pretending he's Douglass, struck by Covey, spitting fire. And when the writer turns to me, what shape will fill his mouth? How many pages will he need for laundry, heaping plates, and croup that breaks at dawn to heed the mark of my accounts? Will it be said that I could speak, seal cracks? And years from now, who will remember bread and stew that set those bound to Canada on their feet? 400 buried shackles in my garden. Will he paint across my truth 100 years from now, or hush me silent on a page that reads, the wife of an important man? Thank you very much. How much time do we have for questions? Not much.
Technically we have 5 minutes.
Oh, God. Oh, I got something wrong. Oh, I'm sorry.
The class won't be coming in this room for another 20 minutes.
Okay.
So people who don't have to go to another, like, say, 3 o'clock class, please.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought we had till 3. I'm sorry.
Questions.
Okay.
We
Any
still
questions?
have some time for questions.
I will make short answers, I promise. I talked so much, they didn't need to ask any.
Did you have some say in the cover?
Oh, yes, I did.
What is the name?
I picked it. See, when you're not dealing with a high sedity poetry press like Gray Wool from Milkweed Editions or that publish the capital P poets, you can make some more moves of your own. So this is a collage by Theodore Harris, who's a friend of mine, and a great collage artist. It's called Betrayal. Yes?
Whatever happened to their children?
Good question. So Rosetta, the older daughter, she tried to be a teacher. That didn't work out as well. She married a formerly enslaved man. And they, you know, like pillar to post jobs. She did teach for a while. The 2 brothers, the 3 brothers, really. The 3 brothers, if you remember the movie Glory, all 3 of them participated in that 54th Massachusetts platoon or whatever it was. That group of black men who were the first to be called up to go fight in the Civil War. They all got back. I think Frederick Jr. had health issues. Then they tried to go in, because Douglass had the North Star, the newspaper, and they all tried to go in that direction towards being newspaper men and printers and journalists. And that was made very hard for them. But that was some of the things they did. They had some other business ventures. Yeah, so. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it is that Frederick didn't write about Anna?
I wish I knew. I hate to lean towards the haters in the history discipline who say, they grew apart. She wasn't his intellectual equal, things like that. But I mean, there is evidence that like she was not going to go quietly into that whole interracial, intellectual, abolitionist, but she wasn't feeling that fully. So she was not at odds, she was in favor of the movement, but socially she wasn't doing what he was doing. So, and then Frederick Douglass, just coming from some real talk, Frederick Douglass was a good looking man. And women, he had a bit of a groupie thing going on at some points. So, there's a way in which that puts a strange tension on a marriage that's already out in the public. So, all of these things working together, I don't know. Maybe I have a poem in which I speculate that he was embarrassed by her. Of course, her daughter would never say that in her little book. So I don't know. All we can do is speculate. But I mean, and she was the one who was always left at home. Sometimes he had to escape for his life to Europe. And sometimes he was on speaking tours in Europe. So he was away a whole lot. And that also puts tension on a marriage. So, you come back and person's looking at you like, oh, here you are. So I don't know. There's no real full way to know, Good question. It's the looming question, always.
Nzadi, what are you working on now?
Oh, I'm working on, I live in Philadelphia. And as was said, I teach at Ursinus College, which is further out than this. It's like, it's 30 minutes past here. And I've been there for over 20 years. So I'm an environmental criminal, okay? I drive back and forth. It's about 50 miles a day. So over that time, I have done a lot of thinking and note-taking and whatever in the car. So I'm working on a collection that's called Driving. And it's the opposite, the gross opposite of this, where this was like going into a little cottage that's filled with all of a certain kind of thing. Driving is all over the place. So I worked in a poem this summer about my father's car when I was 2 years old and he worked out of town and he would come home on the weekends and I saw his car coming up the street. So there are my driving experiences. There's what I think about when I'm driving. It's crazy. I don't know where it's going to end, but that's what I'm working on right now. Did you have a quick question?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you had what was your biggest remaining question about her? Like, if you could have one big question answered about her.
I think it's the one the young lady asked.
You think so?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Because he wrote much more about the second wife.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're just left to wonder. Thank you, people. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the evening.
You can buy a book now, or I guess they'll be in the bookstore. If you have to go be someplace quickly, you can go over to the bookstore and get one. But if you get one now, Dr. Katie can sign it.
Yeah, we can work it out. I could sign it later. Thank you for being so attentive.